Before the story truly begins, let me take a moment to thank you for being here. Out of countless stories, voices, and distractions, you chose to sit with this one. That choice matters. If you stay until the end, you won't just hear a story, you'll witness a life unfold, a decision that reshaped destiny, and a kind of love that rarely finds words. So stay with me, and if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, follow along and remain part of this journey, because what you are about to experience is not rushed, not fragmented, and not ordinary. This story begins quietly, in a place where the world feels smaller and time moves slower, where dreams grow in silence and responsibility arrives early. It begins with a young man named Caleb Rowan, 23 years old, standing at the fragile edge between hope and collapse. Caleb grew up in a modest town in southern Georgia, where the roads were long, the houses were old, and the people carried their burdens with quiet dignity. He was the kind of young man who never complained, even when life demanded more from him than it gave back. He had plans once: college, a career, a future built step by step. But those plans began to fade the moment illness entered his home. His father had always been strong, the kind of man who fixed things with his hands and believed that hard work could solve anything. But illness is not something strength alone can defeat. Hospital visits became frequent, treatments expensive, and the fear of losing everything settled like a shadow over the family. Bills stacked higher each month, and the phone rang constantly with reminders of debt. Caleb watched it all unfold with a quiet ache, knowing that every choice he made now would shape whether his family survived or fell apart. He left college without ceremony. No celebration, no dramatic goodbye, just a decision made out of necessity. Miami was his destination, not because it promised opportunity but because it offered work. Any work. He packed a small bag, hugged his mother, and promised he would send money. Promises come easily when hope still lives in your chest. Keeping them, however, requires sacrifice. Miami overwhelmed him at first. The speed, the noise, the endless glow of lights. It felt like stepping into another universe. Wealth moved openly there, flashing in polished cars, designer clothes, and confident voices. Caleb wasn't part of that world. He moved around it, quietly, invisibly, trying to earn enough to keep his family afloat. He found work at an upscale lounge, the kind where conversations carried power and people spoke casually about things that would have changed his entire life back home. He learned quickly how to move efficiently, how to stay unnoticed, how to keep his thoughts to himself while observing everything. Each night blurred into the next. Work, exhaustion, short phone calls, home, money transfers, worry. He measured his life in paychecks and medical updates. There was no space left for dreams. He wasn't building a future anymore. He was holding the present together. And then came the night everything shifted. The call from home came later than usual. His father's condition had worsened. The doctors needed immediate treatment, and without payment they couldn't continue. The bank had also issued its final warning. The house, the only place that had ever truly felt like safety, would be taken. Caleb sat alone after his shift, the locker room nearly empty, the hum of distant music fading. He stared at his phone for a long time, as if looking hard enough might change the numbers on the screen. He felt the weight of every decision pressing down on him. There was no one to ask for help, no backup plan. Just a quiet realization that sometimes life corners you so completely that the only way forward feels like surrender. The next evening something unexpected happened. He was asked to stay after his shift. Not by a manager, not by a supervisor, but by the owner herself. Her name was Vivian Hale. She was known across the city, not just wealthy but influential, strategic, and almost untouchable in the business world. People spoke carefully around her. She carried authority without raising her voice. But there was something else beneath that power. Something restrained, something tired. Caleb had seen her before, of course. Everyone had. But he had never spoken to her directly. He didn't expect to now. She didn't waste time with formalities. She spoke calmly, directly, as if she had already thought through every word long before he entered the room. She knew about his father. About the debt. About the house. Caleb didn't ask how. He was too stunned to respond at all. Then she said something that made his chest tighten. "I can help you," she said. Not vaguely. Not as sympathy. Specifically. The debts could be cleared. The treatment funded. The house secured. The kind of solution Caleb had stopped believing existed. But nothing in life comes without a cost. She paused before continuing, and in that silence, Caleb felt something shift. like the moment before a storm breaks. "I'm not offering charity," she said. "I'm offering an agreement." Then she made the proposal that would alter both their lives. Not dramatic, not emotional, just steady, deliberate words. She wanted him to marry her. Not for romance. Not for image. For companionship. Stability. Presence. She spoke about her past, about a life filled with success but empty of connection, about losing her husband to a world that valued ambition more than time, and about the loneliness that followed even in rooms full of people. She said she didn't want power anymore. She wanted calm. Someone grounded. Someone who understood responsibility, loyalty, and family. And somehow, she had chosen him. Because he worked quietly. Because he carried himself with integrity. Because he reminded her of something real. Caleb didn't respond immediately. The words felt unreal, almost detached from reality. Marriage? To a woman decades older, powerful, respected, and completely outside his world? It made no sense, and yet, every piece of his life suddenly pointed toward that moment. His father's condition. The debts. The fear. The desperation. That night, sleep never came. He thought about who he was before Miami. The boy who believed life would unfold naturally. The student who imagined building something from nothing. He thought about what he might lose. His youth. His freedom. The version of life he had once imagined. And then he thought about his family. Sometimes decisions aren't made because they feel right. They're made because every other option feels worse. Morning arrived quietly. And with it, a choice. He wasn't choosing love. He wasn't choosing ambition. He was choosing survival. And in that choice, everything began to change. The morning after Caleb Rowan made his decision arrived without ceremony. There was no sense of triumph, no dramatic realization, no feeling of relief. Instead, there was a strange stillness inside him, as if something fundamental had shifted quietly overnight. He moved through his routine almost mechanically, getting dressed, walking to work, nodding politely at coworkers, while his mind replayed the same thought again and again. Everything had changed, and yet nothing looked different. He had agreed. Not out of hope, not out of desire, but out of necessity. And necessity has a way of silencing doubt. When Vivian Hale arrived that evening, the atmosphere in the lounge transformed. Conversations lowered. Managers adjusted their posture. Even the lighting seemed softer around her presence. She carried authority without needing to announce it, moving through the space as if it belonged to her not just legally but naturally. Caleb noticed how effortlessly she navigated the room. She wasn't cold. She acknowledged people with brief nods, listened carefully when spoken to, and spoke with calm precision. Yet there was distance, an invisible barrier that separated her from everyone else. When their eyes met briefly across the room, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Not ownership. Not control. Recognition. Later, in her office, the conversation resumed with the same calm directness as before. No dramatics, no emotional pressure. She spoke as if they were finalizing a business agreement rather than discussing a life-altering commitment. "We'll take this step carefully," she said. "Nothing will be forced. Nothing will be rushed." Her tone held no manipulation. It was measured, respectful. She outlined everything. Legal arrangements, financial protections for his family, medical care for his father, and the structure of their future. It was practical, structured, almost clinical. Yet beneath it, Caleb sensed something deeper. A quiet longing for stability. He listened more than he spoke. Words felt unnecessary. The path ahead had already begun to form. Within days the changes began. The hospital called his mother first. Treatment approved. Payment secured. No delays. The bank followed. The debt was cleared. The house safe. For the first time in months, Caleb heard relief in his mother's voice. Not forced optimism, real relief. She cried softly over the phone, thanking him, calling him strong, calling him brave. He didn't tell her everything. Not yet. Because some truths need time before they can be spoken. The wedding was small. No headlines. No spectacle. No grand declaration. Just paperwork, a quiet ceremony, and two people standing side by side, fully aware that their connection was built on something other than romance. Vivian wore elegance effortlessly. Caleb wore stillness. There were no vows promising passion. Only mutual understanding. Afterward he moved into her home. A sprawling villa that felt less like a house and more like a world unto itself. High ceilings, soft lighting, rooms that seemed to stretch endlessly, and a silence that felt almost sacred. He had never lived in a place like that. It unsettled him at first. Not because of the luxury, but because of the quiet. There were no hospital calls echoing through the walls. No financial arguments. No tension hanging in the air. Peace, he realized, can feel unfamiliar when you've lived too long in survival. Vivian respected his adjustment. She didn't hover. She didn't control his movements. She simply made space, allowing him to learn the rhythm of the house, the routines, the staff, the environment. They spoke often, though not intimately at first. Conversations centered around practical things, daily schedules, responsibilities, expectations. But gradually those conversations began to shift. She asked about his childhood. He told her about fishing trips with his father, about small-town football games, about late nights studying under a dim lamp because the electricity bill had to be conserved. She listened, not politely but attentively. And when she spoke, he learned pieces of her life too. About early success. About relentless pressure. About building an empire that left little room for human connection. There was no self-pity in her voice, just honesty. And slowly, a strange comfort began to form between them. Not attraction, not affection, understanding. The outside world, however, did not remain silent. News travels quickly when wealth is involved. Rumors began circulating, quiet at first, then louder. People speculated, questioned motives, whispered assumptions. At social gatherings, Caleb noticed the glances, the pauses in conversation when he approached, the polite smiles that didn't reach people's eyes. He understood what they saw. A young man from nowhere. A powerful woman decades older. A marriage that didn't fit their expectations. But Vivian never allowed those perceptions to define their reality. At a private dinner one evening, when a guest made a careless remark about opportunism, Vivian responded calmly but firmly. "Respect is not measured by background," she said. "It's measured by character." The room fell silent. Caleb didn't speak, but he felt something shift within him. For the first time since this arrangement began, he didn't feel like an outsider standing in borrowed space. He felt acknowledged. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into months. And something unexpected began to happen. Caleb started noticing the subtle loneliness in Vivian's world. The long evenings, the quiet dinners, the absence of genuine companionship. People respected her, admired her, even feared her. But very few truly knew her. He began sitting with her in the evenings, talking about small things. Not business, not responsibility, life, memories, regrets, moments that shaped them. And in those conversations the distance between them softened. He laughed sometimes, softly, unexpectedly. He realized how rare that sound must have been in her life. And for the first time since agreeing to this marriage, Caleb felt something unfamiliar stir inside him. Not love. Not yet. But connection. Real human connection. He began to understand that this arrangement wasn't just saving his family. It was healing something in her too. Two people brought together by need, slowly learning to share presence. And presence can become the foundation for everything else. Life did not transform overnight after Caleb Rowan and Vivian Hale married. There was no dramatic shift, no sudden closeness. No sweeping wave of emotion that turned their arrangement into something softer. Instead, the change came quietly, almost invisibly, woven into the rhythm of everyday moments. The first weeks in the villa felt unfamiliar to Caleb, not because of the luxury surrounding him, but because of the absence of chaos. For years, his life had been defined by urgency. Medical calls, overdue bills, sleepless nights, constant calculations of what could be sacrificed next. Now the silence inside those walls felt almost unreal. Peace, he realized, could be disorienting when you had spent so long bracing yourself for impact. He woke early each morning out of habit, expecting pressure, expecting something to demand his attention. But the house moved differently. Staff worked quietly. The air felt calm. Nothing was falling apart. That alone unsettled him. He spent hours adjusting to a life where survival was no longer the only goal, where time stretched instead of collapsing under stress. Vivian noticed his restlessness, though she never mentioned it directly. She had a way of observing without intruding, understanding without forcing conversation. She allowed him space, and in that space he began to rediscover himself. Not the version shaped by fear, but the person who had once carried dreams. Their relationship remained respectful, careful, defined by boundaries neither of them crossed too quickly. They ate together most evenings, sometimes in silence, sometimes in conversation that wandered through memories and thoughts rather than obligations. Vivian never asked questions to satisfy curiosity alone. When she asked about his life, she listened with attention that felt genuine, almost protective. Caleb found himself telling stories he hadn't revisited in years. About childhood summers, about learning responsibility too early, about watching his father work until exhaustion but never complain. In return, Vivian spoke about her past not as a series of achievements, but as a timeline marked by absence. She described success as something that had grown louder while her personal world became quieter, how ambition had filled every corner of her life until there was no room left for companionship. Caleb began to see her differently, not as a powerful figure standing above everyone else, but as someone who had carried her own kind of burden for years. Wealth had protected her from certain struggles, but it had not shielded her from loneliness. He noticed the way she paused before entering empty rooms, the way she lingered during conversations that had nothing to do with business, the subtle relief in her expression when laughter interrupted the stillness of the house. There was a humanity beneath her composure that few people ever witnessed. Outside the villa, however, the world continued to judge. Social circles moved quickly, and news of their marriage had spread far beyond what either of them expected. Caleb sensed it in the way people looked at him when he accompanied Vivian to events. The polite smiles, the restrained curiosity, the unspoken assumptions. He could almost hear the questions forming in their minds. Why him? What did he gain? What did she lose? He didn't resent it, but he felt it. A constant awareness that he was being measured, weighed, interpreted by people who had already decided what his presence meant. Vivian never addressed those whispers directly, yet her behavior spoke louder than any defense. She included him in her world without hesitation. Meetings, dinners, quiet conversations with business partners. She treated him as an equal presence, never as a formality. At first, Caleb remained mostly silent, observing the dynamics, learning the language of strategy and negotiation, understanding how decisions were shaped by more than numbers. He noticed how people responded to Vivian. Respect mixed with caution, admiration blended with distance. Power created its own isolation. One evening, during a discussion about a potential investment, Vivian asked for his opinion. The room fell silent. Caleb hesitated, not because he lacked thoughts, but because he wasn't sure if his perspective belonged in that space. Yet her gaze held steady, patient, inviting. So he spoke. Not in the polished language of executives, but in the practical tone of someone who understood people, risk, and reality. He spoke about sustainability, about long-term impact, about how decisions affected not just profit but lives. When he finished, no one interrupted. Vivian nodded slightly, then continued the discussion, weaving his insight naturally into the conversation. That moment marked a shift. Not dramatic, not immediate, but real. He wasn't just present anymore. He was contributing. As weeks passed, his confidence grew quietly. He listened more carefully, asked thoughtful questions, began understanding the complexities of Vivian's world. And in return, she trusted him with more responsibility, not out of obligation but because she valued his perspective. He saw things others overlooked. He understood the human side of decisions. And that perspective began to matter. At home, their connection deepened in subtler ways. They developed routines without planning them. Morning coffee in the sunlit corner of the garden, evenings spent discussing books, memories, or simply sitting in comfortable silence. The distance that had defined their early days softened into familiarity. Caleb no longer felt like a guest in the villa. It became a shared space, shaped by mutual respect. Yet beneath this growing understanding, something more complex began forming inside him. He admired her. Not for her power. Not for her wealth. For her resilience. For the way she carried responsibility without seeking recognition. For the calm strength that allowed her to stand alone for years without breaking. And slowly he began to realize that their arrangement was no longer just a solution to a crisis. It was becoming something else. Something neither of them had planned, something that grew not from expectation but from presence. He saw it in the way she relaxed around him, the way conversations flowed without effort, the way she sometimes allowed silence to exist without filling it. She trusted him, not just with her time but with her vulnerability. That trust changed the atmosphere between them. It replaced caution with ease. Caleb didn't call it love. He wasn't ready to. But he felt the foundation forming beneath his feet, steady and unexpected. Two lives, once moving in completely different directions, now sharing the same path. Not because they had chosen romance, but because they had chosen honesty. And sometimes, honesty creates bonds stronger than anything planned. As the months continued, Caleb understood something that had never been clear before. This marriage had not just saved his family, it had given him a new life, one shaped not by fear but by growth. And within that growth, a connection was forming that neither obligation nor circumstance could fully explain. It was quiet, it was patient, and it was real. Time has a way of revealing truths that cannot be seen in the early days of any decision. And for Caleb Rowan, the months following his marriage to Vivian Hale began to reshape not only how others saw him, but how he saw himself. What had once felt like a fragile arrangement built purely on necessity was slowly turning into a life defined by responsibility, growth, and a connection neither of them had anticipated. It did not happen with sudden declarations or dramatic turning points. It unfolded gradually through ordinary days, quiet conversations, and moments that seemed small until they began to matter. By now, Caleb had grown accustomed to the world he once felt foreign inside. The villa no longer felt intimidating. The staff no longer treated him like a temporary guest. His presence had settled into the rhythm of the household, and with that came a sense of belonging he had not expected to feel so soon. He began to take on small responsibilities without being asked, reviewing schedules, helping coordinate small operational details for Vivian's businesses, offering suggestions when he saw inefficiencies others overlooked. He did not do it to prove himself. It came naturally, shaped by years of learning to notice what needed fixing before it broke. Vivian observed all of it quietly. She rarely praised openly, but her trust grew more visible. She began inviting him into more discussions, not as an obligation but as a partner whose judgment she valued. In business meetings, she no longer introduced him as someone who had joined her life recently. She simply treated him as someone who sees clearly. That subtle shift altered how others responded. The whispers did not disappear, but they softened. Respect began replacing suspicion. Still, the world outside their home remained complicated. High society carried its own unspoken rules, and their marriage did not fit comfortably into any of them. Invitations came regularly, to private dinners, charity events, corporate gatherings, and Caleb accompanied Vivian, aware that every room held people trying to understand their story without asking directly. He could feel it in the glances, the polite conversations that lingered just long enough to measure him. Some spoke kindly, others cautiously, and a few with quiet judgment hidden beneath courtesy. One particular evening stood out more than the rest. It was a private business dinner hosted by a prominent investor known for blunt opinions and sharp observations. The setting was elegant, almost theatrical, dim lighting, polished tables, conversations drifting between strategy and influence. Caleb remained composed, speaking when necessary, listening more often. He had learned that silence could be more powerful than words. The conversation shifted at one point toward leadership and legacy, and someone casually mentioned the unexpected nature of Vivian's recent personal decisions. The tone was polite, but the implication was unmistakable. Another guest added a remark about unconventional partnerships and their risks. It was subtle but deliberate. Caleb felt the tension before it reached him directly. He did not react. Years of watching his father endure hardship had taught him that dignity often lies in restraint. Vivian, however, did not allow the moment to pass. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't display anger. Instead, she spoke with the same calm precision she used in negotiations, but this time her words carried something deeper: certainty. Integrity, she said quietly, is the rarest quality in any room. And it cannot be inherited, purchased, or performed. It's lived. That's why I trust him. Silence followed. No one challenged her. No one tried to redirect the conversation. The subject changed, but the impact remained. Caleb felt it not as validation from the room, but as something personal. An affirmation that his presence beside her was not temporary, not symbolic, not conditional. It mattered. After that night, the shift became undeniable. People began engaging him directly, asking his perspective, inviting his input. He did not seek attention, yet it found him through competence. He noticed patterns others ignored, asked questions others avoided, and spoke with clarity shaped by lived experience rather than theory. His background, once seen as a disadvantage, became his strength. He understood struggle. He understood risk not from spreadsheets but from survival. That perspective began influencing decisions in ways no one had expected. Vivian trusted him with more. Not suddenly but consistently. She asked him to review proposals, attend strategic discussions, observe operations. She never overwhelmed him. She guided quietly, offering context when needed, allowing him to learn through exposure rather than instruction. He respected that approach. It made every lesson feel earned rather than given. Their relationship deepened within this shared purpose. Evenings were no longer defined by distance or cautious politeness. They spoke openly now, not just about daily events but about beliefs, fears, regrets, and hopes that had once remained unspoken. Caleb learned how much Vivian had sacrificed in pursuit of success, how many relationships had faded as her responsibilities grew heavier, how loneliness had slowly become a permanent companion she had learned to accept. He listened without interruption, understanding that sometimes the greatest support is simply being present. And in return he found himself opening up about his own fears. The guilt he had carried leaving his family, the pressure of being their lifeline, the quiet worry that he might fail despite all his efforts. He had rarely spoken those thoughts aloud before. Speaking them now felt like releasing something he had held too tightly for too long. They were no longer just two individuals sharing a structured arrangement. They were partners learning each other's worlds. And somewhere in that process, admiration began to grow into something deeper. Caleb noticed the small things. The way Vivian paused to ensure every staff member felt acknowledged. The way she quietly funded opportunities for employees' families without seeking recognition. The way she remained steady even under immense pressure. Strength, he realized, did not always appear loud or dramatic. Sometimes it lived in consistency. Vivian noticed changes in him too. His posture grew more confident. His voice carried clarity. His decisions became more assured. He no longer hesitated when speaking in rooms filled with influence. He stood firmly in his place, not as someone who had been given opportunity, but as someone who had grown into it. Their bond strengthened not through romance but through trust. Trust built slowly. Trust reinforced daily. Trust that required no performance. And with that trust came a quiet shift in how they moved around each other. Conversations flowed naturally. Silence felt comfortable. Laughter appeared more often. There was warmth now, subtle but undeniable, woven into the space between them. One evening, as they sat in the garden watching the city lights flicker in the distance, Caleb realized something that surprised him. He was no longer thinking about what he had sacrificed. He was thinking about what he had gained. Stability, purpose, growth. A partnership that felt real even if it had begun unconventionally. Vivian too seemed different. Lighter perhaps. Less guarded. The weight she carried had not disappeared, but it was shared now, and sharing changes everything. They did not speak about love. They did not define their relationship with labels. But something meaningful had formed. Not dramatic. Not rushed. Not fragile. Something steady. And steadiness, Caleb realized, can become the strongest foundation for everything that follows. Because when two people choose honesty over illusion, presence over expectation, and understanding over assumption, what they build is not easily broken. It grows quietly, shaping their lives in ways they could never have planned. And for the first time since everything began, Caleb felt certain of one thing. This life, unexpected as it was, had become his own. By the time the seasons shifted and Miami's air softened into the kind of warmth that lingered long into the evenings, Caleb Rowan no longer felt like a visitor inside his own life. The transformation had not been dramatic, and that was perhaps why it was so powerful. Nothing had changed in a single moment, yet everything had slowly realigned. His thoughts were clearer now. His movements carried intention. The uncertainty that once followed him like a shadow had begun to fade, replaced by something steadier. Confidence earned through experience rather than granted through comfort. The world around him, however, had not stopped watching. There were still conversations that quieted when he entered a room, Still glances exchanged between people who believed they understood his story without ever speaking to him. But those reactions no longer unsettled him the way they once had. He had learned something important. People often interpret what they cannot comprehend, and their assumptions rarely define reality. What mattered was the life unfolding in front of him, the responsibilities he carried, and the trust slowly being placed in his hands. Vivian had begun including him more deeply in her work, not through formal announcements, but through quiet invitations that carried meaning. He attended strategic meetings, reviewed operational reports, and accompanied her during visits to various branches of her business network. At first he approached everything cautiously, absorbing information, observing patterns, understanding how decisions were shaped. But gradually his instincts sharpened. He noticed inefficiencies others missed, asked questions that redirected conversations, and spoke with the grounded practicality that came from living through struggle rather than studying it. People began to notice. Not immediately, not loudly, but consistently. Employees who once saw him as an outsider began approaching him for guidance. Managers sought his perspective. Conversations shifted from polite acknowledgement to genuine engagement. Respect, he realized, does not arrive through status. It arrives through presence, consistency, and the ability to listen before speaking. Vivian watched this evolution with quiet satisfaction. She never exaggerated his progress, never praised unnecessarily, but her trust became unmistakable. She gave him room to make decisions, space to observe consequences, and the freedom to grow without fear of failure. That freedom shaped him more than any instruction could have. It forced him to think, to lead, to take responsibility not just for outcomes but for people. And that responsibility began to matter deeply. He started paying closer attention to the employees behind the operations, their stories, their struggles, their ambitions. He recognized the same worries he had carried not long ago. Medical bills, family pressure, the fear of losing stability overnight. It changed how he approached leadership. He stopped seeing work as a system and began seeing it as a network of lives connected by effort. Vivian noticed that too. "You see people," she told him one evening, her voice calm but thoughtful. "That's rare." Caleb didn't respond immediately. He wasn't used to hearing his strengths spoken aloud. But the words stayed with him, echoing long after the conversation ended. Their evenings had grown warmer, more relaxed, defined by a quiet companionship that neither of them tried to label. They spent time talking in the garden, walking through the villa's long corridors, sharing moments of stillness that felt natural rather than forced. There was no urgency in their connection, no need to define where it was heading. It existed in the present, grounded and real. The following months brought an unexpected rhythm to Caleb Rowan's life. A rhythm he had never imagined possible when he first stepped into Vivian Hale's world. Miami's heat had softened into the golden hues of early fall, and with it came a sense of balance Caleb hadn't known in years. He had grown comfortable in the villa, not because of its luxury, but because of the trust and respect that had settled between him and Vivian. Their days were structured yet fluid, filled with shared responsibilities, quiet understanding, and a steady companionship that transcended the expectations of anyone outside their walls. Caleb had begun taking a more active role in Vivian's business ventures, but his approach was always grounded in observation and practicality rather than ambition. He learned to navigate the nuances of management, from evaluating operational efficiency to understanding the human dynamics behind every decision. He noticed the subtle ways in which people responded to authority, and how small acts of recognition could transform morale. Employees who had once been wary of his presence now approached him for guidance, drawn not by his status, but by his insight and the authenticity of his perspective. Caleb realized that his life had shifted in ways far beyond material comfort. He was learning to lead, to guide, and to influence, not through power but through understanding. Vivian, too, had changed in ways Caleb observed quietly. She was no longer the woman defined solely by her accomplishments or by the isolation of her position. There was a softness in her evenings now, a willingness to linger in conversations that had nothing to do with business. They shared meals in the sunlit dining room, sometimes with no words exchanged, simply enjoying each other's presence. She trusted him implicitly, confiding in him about decisions that were difficult even for her to make alone. And Caleb, in turn, offered opinions rooted not in authority but in honesty, something Vivian valued far more than any polished strategy. Despite the domestic stability, the world beyond the villa continued to challenge them. Miami's elite watched their partnership with a mixture of curiosity, skepticism, and sometimes thinly veiled disdain. Invitations to galas and high-profile events came regularly, and Caleb noticed the subtle judgments in the way people addressed him, the questions that hovered unspoken in polite conversations. Yet Vivian never allowed these external opinions to affect their dynamic. At a particularly tense charity dinner, when a guest questioned the practicality of their marriage, Vivian's response was measured and deliberate. "Character and integrity are far more valuable than appearances," she said, her eyes locking onto Caleb's. And Caleb demonstrates both daily. The statement, quiet as it was, reverberated throughout the room. Caleb didn't need validation from strangers, but the acknowledgement from Vivian felt grounding, a silent confirmation that he belonged in her world not by convenience but by merit. At home, the growth of their relationship took on a deeper, more personal dimension. They began to explore the roots of each other's pasts, the childhoods that had shaped them, the experiences that had hardened them, the regrets and small triumphs that made them human. Vivian spoke more openly about her late husband, revealing not just the failures of their relationship but the ways ambition had consumed them both. Caleb listened intently, understanding that her choices were not driven by entitlement or revenge, but by a desire to avoid repeating old mistakes. He saw the woman she had become, not simply the magnate who commanded attention, and the realization made his admiration for her deepen. Caleb, for his part, began to share parts of himself that he had long kept hidden. Stories of his small-town upbringing, the nights spent worrying over his father's health, the moments when the weight of family obligations threatened to crush him. Vivian didn't judge, she didn't interrupt, she simply listened. And in those exchanges, a new layer of intimacy emerged, built not on passion but on trust, empathy, and shared understanding. Their connection grew not through grand gestures but through consistency. Evenings spent discussing trivial matters, mornings reviewing operational details together, quiet walks around the villa grounds. All of it wove a fabric of companionship that was both comforting and stabilizing. Caleb began to notice subtle changes within himself. He was calmer, more patient, and more confident, not in the way of a man who had achieved power, but in the way of someone who understood responsibility and the nuances of human connection. One day, as they walked through the garden, Vivian paused to look at him with a contemplative expression. "You've changed, Caleb," she said softly. "Not because of me or this house or the opportunities you've been given. You've changed because you've learned to see clearly, to trust yourself, and to carry responsibility with grace. That is rare." Caleb felt warmth spread through him, a quiet acknowledgement of his journey. It was one thing to survive, it was another to grow, and he was beginning to see the distance he had traveled. The evolution of their partnership extended beyond the private sphere. As Caleb became more confident in his role, he began to contribute actively to business strategy. He offered insights into community engagement, employee well-being, and long-term sustainability. His perspective, grounded in practicality and human understanding, began to influence decisions in ways that were subtle but profound. And Vivian, recognizing the value of his input, allowed him the autonomy to implement suggestions, fostering a sense of shared ownership that neither had expected at the outset. Despite the progress, life was not without tension. There were disagreements, mostly over operational choices or differences in perspective. Yet these conflicts were handled with respect, discussion, and compromise, reinforcing the mutual trust that had become the cornerstone of their partnership. The challenges they faced were no longer purely external. They were internal negotiations that required understanding and patience. And with each resolution, their bond strengthened, built not on convenience or obligation, but on collaboration and shared purpose. The villa itself became a symbol of their evolving life. The rooms that had once felt intimidating were now familiar. The quiet corners where they shared conversations and moments of reflection became sanctuaries. Even the staff, who had initially approached Caleb cautiously, now treated him with respect and warmth, recognizing his genuine involvement and commitment. He was no longer an outsider. He had carved a place for himself within Vivian's world, a place defined by contribution, trust, and integrity. And through it all, a deeper emotional connection began to flourish. It was not the kind of passionate romance Caleb had once imagined in youth, nor was it the fiery intensity of novels and films. It was steadier, more enduring. A love shaped by respect, shared experience, and the slow unveiling of vulnerability. Vivian trusted him with pieces of herself she had not revealed to anyone else, and he responded with patience, understanding, and care. Their companionship had become a sanctuary in a world that often demanded performance over authenticity. As the days unfolded, Caleb realized something profound. What he had gained through this unconventional marriage extended far beyond financial security for his family or stability in his own life. He had discovered a partnership rooted in mutual respect, empathy, and shared growth. A connection that challenged conventional definitions of love and success. It was a partnership that required daily nurturing, honest communication, and the willingness to face both external judgment and internal uncertainty. And in that partnership, Caleb began to find a sense of purpose he had never known before. Not the purpose defined by obligation or duty alone, but the kind of purpose that comes from shaping a life alongside someone whose values align with your own. He understood that true strength does not reside in wealth, status, or recognition, but in the ability to build, protect, and nurture connections that matter. Even as Miami's society continued to speculate, whisper, and judge, the world inside the villa remained theirs, crafted not by expectation but by choice. Every decision, every conversation, every shared moment became a thread in the tapestry of their life together. And for the first time in a long while, Caleb felt grounded, capable, and seen, not merely as a man who had stepped into opportunity, but as someone who had earned his place in both a world of influence and a space of intimacy. The growth was quiet, deliberate, and steady, yet it was unmistakable. Caleb Rowan, once a young man driven by necessity, had transformed into a partner who contributed, supported, and inspired. And Vivian Hale, once solitary in her power, had rediscovered companionship, trust, and the subtle joys of being understood. Together they were no longer defined by circumstance. They were defined by the life they were choosing to build, one day, one conversation, one moment at a time. In that life, Caleb understood finally, real wealth was not counted in currency or status. It was counted in trust, presence, growth, and the quiet strength of love built over time. And as he looked across the villa one evening, seeing Vivian in the soft glow of the sunset, he realized they had arrived at a place neither of them could have anticipated at the start. A place of steady, enduring connection shaped by honesty, resilience, and the courage to embrace life as it truly was. The villa was quiet that morning, the soft hum of the city below mingling with the faint rustle of palm trees swaying in the breeze. Caleb Rowan stood on the terrace, sunlight warming his face, watching the waves of Miami's skyline stretch toward the horizon. For a moment he allowed himself to pause, not out of leisure but because he had earned the right to pause. Years of pressure, of endless responsibility, had conditioned him to keep moving, to measure every second, to calculate every risk. Now, in the calm of this space, he realized that life could exist without constant strain, that growth could be steady, and that love, true, quiet, unassuming love, could exist without tumultuous drama. Vivian Hale joined him, her presence soft but confident, a balance to his grounded energy. They had developed an unspoken rhythm, a connection that no longer needed explanation or justification. Morning coffee was no longer a chore. It had become a ritual of shared presence, an acknowledgement that despite everything that had come before, they had built a life together. Not perfect, not flawless, but real and sustaining. Caleb handed her the steaming cup, their fingers brushing briefly, and in that small, ordinary gesture he felt the weight of months of growth, trust, and companionship condensed into a single, fleeting moment. Their mornings were often spent in quiet conversation now, reflecting on the past, planning the future, or simply observing life as it unfolded. On this particular morning they spoke about Caleb's family, his father's improved health, the stability that had returned to their home, and the small joys that came from seeing loved ones thrive without constant fear of financial collapse. Vivian listened attentively, offering support, validation, and insight, yet never dominating the narrative. Caleb realized she had a remarkable ability to honor someone else's experiences without overshadowing them, a quality that made her formidable in business and invaluable in life. The afternoon brought the next step in their shared journey. Vivian suggested they take a trip to Caleb's hometown, a place he hadn't seen in years, weighed down by memories of hardship, and the source of his determination to secure his family's future. At first he hesitated. The town was small, unpretentious, and he feared the stark contrast between it and Vivian's world might highlight disparities that could never be reconciled. But her voice carried quiet reassurance. "We're going there together," she said simply. "Not as an obligation but as a choice. I want to see where your life began. I want to understand everything that shaped you." The journey itself was unremarkable to anyone else. Hours spent in transit, glimpses of landscapes shifting from urban bustle to rural expanses, but for Caleb it was symbolic. Each mile bridged two worlds that had once seemed impossible to reconcile: the life of a young man burdened by necessity, and the life of a woman accustomed to influence, wealth, and isolation. By traveling together, they were literally and figuratively crossing divides, acknowledging that their union was not about compromise alone, but about integration. Upon arrival, Caleb's family greeted them with warmth and curiosity. His parents, older now but stable and relieved, welcomed Vivian without hesitation. There was gratitude in their eyes, appreciation for what she had made possible, but there was also recognition that her presence was not merely transactional. Vivian engaged with them genuinely, asking questions, listening to stories, and sharing her own reflections in ways that felt sincere rather than performative. For the first time, Caleb realized that she was not only embracing him but embracing the entire tapestry of his life, weaving herself into its threads rather than attempting to alter them. The visit reinforced something Caleb had long suspected but had only recently felt in full. True partnership was not about power or control. It was about presence, authenticity, and the willingness to engage deeply with another's world. Watching Vivian interact with his family, he understood that she had chosen him not out of obligation or pity, but because she recognized integrity, resilience, and the capacity for growth. And in that recognition he felt a profound sense of belonging, not only to her but to the life they were creating together. Returning to Miami, the perspective Caleb had gained from the trip began to manifest in every aspect of their life. He approached his responsibilities with renewed clarity, balancing business acumen with empathy, strategy with understanding, and leadership with humility. Vivian, observing the subtle evolution, offered opportunities for him to expand further, introducing him to key partners, involving him in high-stakes negotiations, and entrusting him with decisions that would impact the company's future. Each opportunity reinforced the mutual respect at the core of their relationship, and Caleb embraced them with a sense of purpose grounded in experience, not ambition alone. Evenings were now filled with reflection, conversation, and subtle moments of connection that required no words. They sat together in the villa's garden, watched sunsets bleed into the horizon, and spoke of everything from the mundane to the profound. Caleb had learned to observe the weight Vivian carried and to offer support without intrusion. Vivian, in turn, had grown to trust him not only with decisions, but with her vulnerabilities, her reflections, and her uncertainties. The balance they had achieved was delicate yet resilient, grounded in shared experience rather than expectation. It was during one of these evenings that Caleb finally articulated what had been growing quietly within him for months. He spoke not of love in the dramatic sense, but of appreciation, respect, and admiration. He expressed gratitude for her presence, for her trust, for the way she had allowed him to grow alongside her rather than beneath her. Vivian listened, and when she responded, it was with the same quiet honesty that had characterized their journey. She acknowledged the bond they had cultivated, one not born of convention but of shared patience, trust, and understanding. And it was then that Caleb understood fully. This marriage, begun in necessity, had become a partnership in every meaningful sense of the word. Their lives, once separate and unaligned, were now intertwined through choices, respect, and the deliberate cultivation of connection. It was a love not defined by fireworks or instant passion, but by stability, growth, and enduring trust. As night settled over the villa, Caleb turned to the camera of his life, the metaphorical lens through which every moment of struggle, sacrifice, and growth had been captured, and addressed the unseen audience that had journeyed with him in spirit. To anyone watching, reading, or listening, he would say, if the words were meant to reach them, life is rarely simple and love rarely begins as we imagine. But if we choose honesty, trust, and presence, if we embrace growth alongside those who respect and challenge us, we discover a wealth far greater than fortune alone. I encourage you to reflect on your own life, your own choices, and your own partnerships. Share your experiences, your triumphs, your struggles. Write them down. Speak them aloud. Comment below. Let someone else see that authenticity matters, that connection is possible, and that love, quiet, steady, enduring love, can emerge in the most unexpected places. In that moment, Caleb realized that the story he had lived, the path he had chosen, and the partnership he had built were not just his own. They were an invitation, a call to recognize that real wealth lies in sacrifice, presence, and the courage to embrace life with honesty. And with Vivian beside him, steady, patient, and unwavering, he knew that this chapter of their lives was only the beginning. The journey was far from over, but the foundation was unshakable. And for the first time, Caleb felt ready not only to continue building their life together but to share its lessons openly, encouraging others to find strength in connection, courage in vulnerability, and richness in love that transcends circumstance. So if you are reading this, watching this, or listening now, take a moment. Reflect. Comment. Share your experiences, your feelings, your stories. Every voice matters, every perspective adds depth, and every act of honesty brings us closer to understanding the power of life lived fully, with integrity, and with love that grows quietly but endures fiercely. Because in the end, it is not the wealth we accumulate nor the status we achieve, but the connections we cultivate, the trust we honor, and the love we nurture that define the true measure of a life well lived.